So hello, welcome all of you. This is the very start of a six-part series. This is actually John's idea. I'll introduce you to John in just a second. And John felt it would be really great to talk about threat modeling in a way that broke it down, made it easier, more accessible. And of course, at Serious Risk, we said, yes, let's do it. So I'll let John explain in more detail about this series and what you can expect in just a moment, considering it was your idea.
Thanks,
Um,
Claire.
You're welcome. But we're very happy to be here. And clearly, this is a subject that resonates because there are 223 of you that registered for this session. So hopefully, we'll see that number keep rolling up as you all join. But for now, it's my privilege to introduce two fantastic people. I'll do my best to give you both a worthy introduction. I am going to look at the slide to read your job title correctly, John. So John Taylor is Senior Application Security Architect at Deloitte. And of course, threat modeling wouldn't be complete without Adam Shostack. So Adam's here as well, President of Shostack and Associates, of course, and lead threat modeling expert and author. So thank you both so much for being here to share your wisdom so that others may benefit. It's very, very great to have you here.
Right. Thank you, Claire.
And then in terms of what's on the menu today, as I mentioned, John will intro this series in just a second and what you can expect from not just this episode, but future ones. We'll look at where to begin. We'll look at where you are now. Scope, of course, a crucial part of threat modeling. So that's part of today as well. And then finally, we'll take a look at frameworks to take you forward on your next steps. And if you have any questions, there will be a Q&A at the end, but you can also ask throughout. And if they don't get answered at that time, we'll make sure that they're answered at the end. So we'll be monitoring those as we go.
Yeah.
And I think that's it. So let's kick this off. I hope you all enjoy.
Right.
And over to you, John and Adam.
Great. All right. Thank you so much. Let's begin. You want to go on to our next slides? All right. So just the acknowledgement disclaimer. Just want you to know that this is me speaking on the behalf of myself, not that of my employer. Sort of the standard disclaimer out here. Just wanted to make sure that people were aware of that. Not really a whole lot to talk about this here, so we kind of skip forward and let's just get into the whole series. So first off, I just want to set an expectation about what this series is. What is it about? It's around building the sustainable, successful threat modeling program. As you can see, we have 6 parts here that we'll be doing over the next 6 months. And so we have different speakers that I'll be with through each one of these. So today we have Adam, and we're going to talk about setting the scene. So each one of these series, and if you want to go ahead and flip to the next slide, it's about that long-term success. I'm not going to explain exactly how to threat model. It's really more around building your program from threat modeling. However, if you're non-threat modeling, there's still a lot of value for you to be here to think about what am I going to be doing once I've started. I also want you to know that each session is going to build upon each other to give you a more complete picture about building the program. You're going to leave and walk away with a lot of key takeaways as you go through this entire series. And of course, the webinars will be posted later online for viewing. So, and with that, let's sort of begin. Let's dig in. So, and we want to go ahead and set the stage about where we are and what we have to look for as we move into building out a program around threat modeling. So I guess one of the first things here to think about is understanding where you are. And it's kind of a crucial step. We want to determine the direction where you want to go with your program. Come up with a lot of things to think about and to think through as you're considering the direction of your program. So there's a couple of things that I think we both want to ask is around, have you started a threat model? And I know that we have a poll about this, and maybe we can launch that poll first, and then we'll dig into kind of the responses from this. Do we have that poll ready? Yeah.
Yep, that's up there on everybody's screen.
Excellent.
Hosts and panelists can't vote. John, we can't stuff the vote here.
Let's just say no threat modeling, Adam.
No, it literally says at the bottom of the
I know. We're not able to vote, but if you were to vote, Adam, what would you say?
I actually do some threat modeling. You know, since we don't ship a lot of product other than training, we don't have a lot of formalized threat modeling at Shostack and Associates. Yeah. Somewhat ironic.
Well, I have a team that does do a lot of threat modeling, and myself, it's just some. Oh, this is really good to hear. So we do have a few folks that aren't doing any threat modeling, and a lot of people are some threat modeling, and a few that do have a program in place. So that's really good to hear about. I want to talk a little bit about those that are not, and just kind of give you some direction about things. And Adam, you've been doing this for the long time, and you really are the leading expert on this. And maybe what are your thoughts when somebody is starting? And we have a couple of things listed here. Can you give us some more insight onto these things?
Yeah, so I will do that, but the thing I want to say is the words that actually title chapter 1 of my book, which are dive in and threat model. And it's easy to make this into a big scary thing, but it's so important to do, to actually build muscle rather than think about what you could do. And this is really a focus of the Threat Modeling Manifesto, is a preference for doing threat modeling over talking about threat modeling. And the manifesto kicks off with my 4-question framework of what are we working on, what can go wrong, what are we going to do about it, and did we do a good job, or in manifesto speak, a good enough job. Talking about a preference for talking about versus doing, arguing over words, but really getting going and simply answering the 4 questions is a great place to start. And then resources like Threat Modeling Connect, training programs, we do training, other folks do training, but you don't, and look, I'm going to talk against my own interests here for a second. You don't need to start with training. You can start by asking the 4 questions, and then training becomes a part of how we build a successful, sustainable program.
Yeah.
But just asking what can go wrong on this thing that I'm working on right now is going to pay some dividends.
Yeah, no, those are great points you bring up, and training, which I'll have a bit more on that in a later session about what you're talking about around the sustainable long-term program, because I think that's where that becomes part of the thing that you really need as you grow, right, and as you build out that program. And for those of you that are and you have a program, if you've got a program, of course, we can always learn and we can make it more, and it's going to be based on your needs. But I think from this point, when we kind of set this stage, we need to really learn about where you are and those things that we think about. Let's go ahead and move into our next slide. So where are you, right? So a lot of the things that I've looked at, oh, we lost the slide here. You want to bring that back, Claire? Yeah. So it's kind of taking the fact of what do your modeling efforts look like? And it doesn't really matter where you are, because we can always look to improve, take things to the next level. And what I mean about where your modeling efforts are is like, is it you doing it manually? It's a great place to start. You learn a lot from that. We think about ad hoc, repeatable processes and maturities of models. So, when I think about manually myself, when I first started, was around like, I need to really understand how to do this, right? Learning this process. And then from there, my capability is matured, and then looking at repeatability. And I think that this is kind of the key area when you look at how you want to move forward to build that program. So Adam, I know you've done this so much, and your thoughts around this on how we look at threat modeling today as we plan forward to look at those factors that we want to drive that direction. And what are you seeing across the industry and what you've experienced yourself?
I see an awful lot of enthusiasts. And the thing that I really want to emphasize as people start with manual threat modeling, with ad hoc threat modeling, is I see a lot of what I call the apprenticeship model of learning. People who picked up threat modeling from someone that they knew who did it, and this is a great place to start and recognizing that not everyone, you know, wants to read a 600-page book or even a 200-page book on how to threat model is an important thing to recognize. And that as we go, you know, you don't have like a big flashing red line here between ad hoc and repeatable, but there's a transition. And I think this is the thing that excites me about this series is we're talking about this transition and what the other side of this looks like.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, you know, that transition, and I've been discovering this as I've grown in building a program and doing this, is it starts to happen kind of naturally, right? As you continue to mature and this, you know, becomes more repeatable, you have more of a defined way how you want to operate. And that just continues to add maturity to how you're doing things. Your ability to model even becomes more mature. I'd like to dive into that a little bit more on the maturity of models. And I kind of look at it from 3 levels, right? You know, starting off very simplistic. And I think we have a little bit more on that on the next one. But basically, you know, with that being said, is maturity is around. If you want to go back one more, go back one slide. Yeah. So on that maturity of models, thinking about very simplistic terms. You know, the objects, the components of an application, user flows, data flows, even just the data flow diagram, and then where do I start adding application functions? Where do I start adding underlying infrastructure? So do I then move to those 3 layers of how I look at my model? And, you know, it can be get kind of complex, but I'll say that as I've moved away from ad hoc and doing things manual, those layers have started to build upon each other to give me more insight into what I really can be looking at. So when I look for what can go wrong, I even have deeper insight to figure out what am I going to do about it? Because it might be something functional versus, you know, infrastructure. And that also takes me to a little bit more into this about scale, right? What are your kind of your thoughts on the maturity, and then how does that lead to scale and that repeatable process?
So I think the thing that I see is every big organization that we work with has competing priorities, right? And a couple of years ago, that was figuring out how we're going to do business in a distributed world because of health concerns. Today, there's a lot of focus on AI and how does AI influence our business. And anytime you want to build a process and change the way an organization works, especially a big organization, leaders are looking for proof of value. Show me that this change is worth making.
Yeah.
And really, when I look to scale, the place you said a few minutes ago, and I was thinking about jumping in, that it happens naturally. And at a lot of organizations it does, because threat modeling shows value very quickly in a lot of organizations. And in some, we see this, what I think of as an impedance mismatch, where the person promoting threat modeling is thinking about whatever it is they're thinking about, and the exec is thinking in different terms. And so they're talking past each other. And when you're talking past each other, when you're not aligned on those goals, the proof points people bring up are the wrong proof points. The things they talk about in scaling are wrong. And the metaphor I want to use is it gets jammed up. And it's like taking a lid off a jar. Sometimes the lid just comes off, and sometimes it's stuck, and you really need to twist the heck out of it.
I got a good tip for that. Take a little butter knife and just sort of tap around the edges. Not too hard. You don't want to jar. And then you sort of loosen it up enough to where you can get out.
Oh, me, I turn it over and whack it on the counter.
Okay, there you go. Another way. But yeah, no, it's a great way to think about that. Getting that. Some jars are easier than others. So,
And I think it's important for the folks in the webinar today
mhm.
to recognize if it's hard, getting an understanding that it's hard, realizing that that's okay, and there are techniques ranging from the butter knife to the whack it on the counter
Yeah.
that help us get through that situation.
Yeah, no, this is a great point. And so these different elements here that we think about where we are in our threat modeling, these are the factors. This helps us to drive a direction. And really kind of from there, it's like, where do you want to go, right? What are your objectives? And Claire, if you want to move us to the next slide, and that's kind of the next thing. It's those factors determine the direction and where your organization wants to go. But one of the things that, really around this, and you're bringing this up now, is that the buy-in, who is going to support you in this? Because determining where you want to go, and you have a plan for this, who's going to support you in this journey? If you're a small organization, right, it could be very easy. If you only have a couple products, it's just you, maybe it's very easy to talk to folks and you start showing that value, it becomes a very simple, natural growth process. But when you start looking at organizations that are more complex, then more people are involved. And so one of the big things, of course, and everybody kind of knows this, no matter what kind of program you're doing, whether it be threat modeling or anything else, it's your buy-in from leadership, right? And of course, as you mentioned, it's like, why should we be doing this? And that was about the value you spoke about, right? If there's some value there, then there's the buy-in from that. One of the other things too is around other stakeholder support, right? Those that are involved in threat modeling. A lot of times it's like, oh, is it security? Is it the app teams, architects, business owners, development? Who else, right? So I think when we look at programs that we kind of focus on just the area of who's benefiting from the model. But what about the other stakeholders that also support that? So I'm curious as to, your thoughts, Adam, too, about where the other stakeholders may live and who are those folks and how they help support this to help you grow and mature and build the program. And that's really kind of the thought is around that, how those stakeholders help build the program.
Yeah, so the first thing I want to say here is I have never met anyone who doesn't have an opinion about what can go wrong. I have met lots of people who have been shut down in various ways.
Yeah.
Debates over what's a threat, a desire to use a kill chain or some other relatively jargon-rich system. People who are not feeling welcome in the conversation, whose somebody glares at them as they start to speak up for the first time and they shut up. And I think it's so important. All of the people who the company is paying to be there, we're paying for their brains. And we ought to encourage them and create mechanisms for them to speak. And so when we talk about stakeholder support, having an opportunity for people to come together to talk about what can go wrong in a supportive, inviting, effective, meaningful way is just so important. And one of the things that I see when I work with organizations is the value of labels on work. In the agile world, talking about backlog grooming, where we come together to talk about what we're going to do in the next sprint, makes time for that important work. Talking about retrospectives makes time for that important work. And making time for an open discussion across the organization, because no one ever makes time for cross-organizational conversation. And that's a thing that can really get stakeholders involved, because if you tell them we care about what you have to say, you demonstrate it, you capture it in lists, and then when we get to the what are we going to do about it question, we address it, they feel, hey, this program is going in a better way. I feel it's more likely to succeed because we're managing these dangers. And that getting that stakeholder support leads to defining the scope of the program, right? Because we want
Yeah.
support from those folks. We need to scope them in. We need to, I'm going to invent a word. We need to methodologize them in. We need to create
Yeah.
methodologies that give them a role, and then we put it into action.
Yeah. No, it's a great point, actually. I like how you describe that. I think that's bringing that together in the scope of your program kind of plays a key role
And
on
actually,
how we look at that and how we do it. Yeah.
I'd like to address a question from Swapnil
Oh,
because this is perfect here. And
mhm.
Swapnil asks about when leadership buys into threat modeling, how do we prioritize it to make it part of the SSDLC, the software security dev life cycle?
Love
And
it.
I
Love
want to
it.
put threat modeling in a slightly different place. I want to put threat modeling in the product life cycle. I want to make it part of what are we working on early on. And if we, and I don't mean to denigrate the work people are doing in SDLs, but I really want to think about it as a business priority as well as a technical priority because that leads to sustainable programs.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. In a recent application that I modeled, that was exactly kind of the situation. It's like where that comes in. It's part of the product's life cycle. Is it considered a security activity? Well, yes, but also no. So it's kind of a combination of things as you do this, your program grows, your threat modeling maturity grows, where you're involved with the various stakeholders. A business owner, they may not necessarily know about some of the security, what can go wrong, what to do about it, but they know what their product is and how it's used. And that support from them is integral to understand the business aspect of what's going on. So yes, there are elements of security, but there's also the understanding of what the business is doing. So these are the things that go into building that program, is making sure that you can account for those things as well. All right. So I know there's another question here, and I'd like to get back to that in a little while here. So as we move forward, because I think you might find some of the stuff that's coming up may help answer that question for you. So putting all this things and leads us to scoping our program, right? And that's kind of where, how are we going to do this? We know where we want to go. We want to think about this stuff, but how do we bring this down to something that's repeatable, maintainable, and how do we do that? So let's talk about this. And so when I'm saying about scope, I'm not talking about the scope of the product in the model itself. I'm talking about in the program. And that's kind of like how we threat model. And it goes a long ways to building the base into our program. So what do we think about threat modeling and scope? And then also talking about process flows. Now there's more to come on that. Um, so when we think about threat modeling scope, one of the fun things is that I've gotten asked a lot is, are we going to threat model everything? Oh, sure, great. Should we? Absolutely, would love to. But we may not be able to right off the bat. And so we think about what can we do? And some threat modeling is better than no threat model. So we need to look at how we scope what we're doing for our threat modeling. I mentioned here too, going back, modeling existing applications, which I also still love to do because that tells us a lot and brings things forward. And so some of the other points here, Adam, I'm sure you have a lot to say around these things. I think you're ready to say a few things here. So please go ahead.
Who, me, Wordy? Uh, so I think one of the places I see organizations fall down is that they want every threat model to be both comprehensive and formal. And each of those takes a lot of work.
Mm.
And when you're getting started, just asking the 4 questions, saying, what can go wrong with this application? Yeah, this is brochureware, no big deal. Or, I don't know, to pick an example at random, This is call records for everyone in the United States. No big deal. Maybe we
Yeah.
shouldn't say that one is no big deal, but I said 5 words, call records for everyone, 6, whatever, 10 words. That's a threat model. What can go wrong? Information disclosure, that stuff could leak. What are we doing to protect it? We can threat model every application at a really light touch, and then program maturity involves thinking about this not as a yes no, but as a spectrum from a little bit to very in depth.
Yeah.
And that's a point of maturity, is you're not thinking about every one of these needs a 50-page PDF that's reviewed by 100 different teams.
Yeah. It goes a long way when looking at the maturity and the quality that you're planning for, and really kind of outlining what that scope looks like. As you progress forward, starting off with a simplistic sake, some organizations, you may already have people doing diagrams that you can leverage. There may be, different ways that you bring that in, but that allows you over time to build the maturity of that. And one of the things too around that maturity is how we're handling our model's life cycle. I think one of the things that we have a tendency to forget, oh, we've modeled it, it's done. That is not what it is. Remember to keep in the fact that the models are alive as long as that product is existing and being developed and it's still running, your model still exists. And looking at that from a scope perspective is making sure that you're identifying that that is part of what you're doing in your program. And also understanding when is it time to archive that away. So if I decommission my app and I'm setting it aside, I'm archiving my code, doing all that kind of fun stuff, code escrow, whatever that may be for you, maybe that's a moment in time where that threat model goes away. However, there's still a lot of benefit from that model that you've learned that may be applied elsewhere. So one of the other things that always kind of comes up too is who's going to threat model? Everybody. But let's be real. So let's think about that. So Adam, is it possible everyone threats model? Everybody can do this?
Everyone does threat model, but when it's everyone's responsibility, it's no one's responsibility. And so figuring out, and I think we've got a slide on this, who's going to do it, but using tools like RACI, and if you're not familiar with RACI, it stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And it's a way of defining who's got what participation in what tasks.
Yep.
And using that, the journey is the reward, right? The goal is not having a table that shows who's doing what. The value is having the conversations that lead to alignment that's represented and recorded in a table, so that everyone has had a chance to say, hey, here at our organization, I think every developer is responsible for threat modeling, and the SRE team is consulted. And when the app goes from active development to operationally running and is in sort of maintenance mode, not getting a lot of new features, maybe that flips around and SRE is now primarily responsible for owning that threat model. Thinking through that, and this, John, this goes to your point about threat models being alive, thinking about who the organization expects to be doing what work is so very important.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely. One of the things, that RACI does help us, and it helps us grow and understand who's doing what, where, when. And then also brings me to the other point is around, your process flows of how you're threat modeling, and looking at the RACI can also help us define who's drawing the models, who's doing analysis. Do I need reporting options for leadership? Do I need, who's going to update, like you mentioned? So maybe it moves over to the SREs, and maybe they're the ones that are doing the updates. Maybe you have a security champion, right? That as they're attending their different sprint planning sessions, PIs, or whatever you want to call them based on any agile methodologies you may use. But at some point, there's going to be a planning session to say, hey, these are the 5 new features I want to work on. So on these 5 new features, they can realize that, hey, there's these different things. So let's go ahead and do the update and model just those new features, right? So that goes back to also the scoping of every application or parts of an application, right? So, and then we do that. And then of course, we repeat, it goes back to keeping with that life cycle of the model. So, and then we have another interesting to think about in scoping, frameworks. People ask about frameworks, what frameworks to use, and that is very much can be part of your scope. So if we want to move to the next slide here, maybe we got a little bit more, but before we dive into frameworks, I do want to talk about one more thing. If you're threat modeling in your organization, you need to think about how you do this consistently with quality across the organization, no matter how big, no matter how small. So really thinking about how you're bringing this into your organization, how do you deliver this? And so these are some of the things that I see where people maybe are doing this well, maybe not doing it so well. And this is a kind of something that I've discovered over time. I think, Adam, you've seen this as well. Is like, how do I bring this to the organization away to delivering that value and being consistent? And so a lot of the things that we're just talking about leads to that. But how do I actually get it there? And so what I've seen is self-service. And I think this is about where everybody learns, we train, they are the ones building their models, right? They're producing the outputs. And then you have, and this is the one that I love the most, is a collaborative service where you're working with people together, folks in security, the application teams, SREs, devs, et cetera. And you're building these, you're analyzing these, you're putting, creating outputs, and you place those into your backlog, like you mentioned earlier, backlogs, right? That's where those teams are working. So we need to make sure that we collaborate in a way that everybody knows how to work. Right. And then we think about a full service. And to me, that is just bring me all your data. I still have to work with you, but I'm going to do all the heavy lifting. That's really what it boils down to, because some teams may be under a severe amount of pressure, deadlines, et cetera. They don't have the time to devote to drawing or to working through those things or spending time in multiple sessions. So there's ways to do that. And so, Adam, I know you've got a lot of thoughts on this as well.
So the first thing I want to say is I look at what's on this slide as increasing maturity. At the top, we've got self-service where teams start and complete their own threat models. Is the sustainable state. And getting there often requires this full service model at the start. But, if teams don't have time to draw their diagrams, they probably also don't have time to brief the threat modeling team. And the results that come out of these full service models, often they don't have buy-in, or the team doing the threat modeling work doesn't have enough of the context to make good recommendations. And this really ties to something that an anonymous attendee asked a few minutes ago, which is, how do you get to a repeatable process which involves reviewing so many applications or features? And I hate to say this, the word reviewing is a red flag for me. If I'm working on my feature and I put it into a queue for a review and I get my review a month later, how many days has that feature been in production before I hear about the security problems that might be there? And so I really think that aiming towards self-service, figuring out what you need to make that work in your organization, the tooling support, the training, the processes to make it go, is the thing that we need to do, because it's the thing that functions. And there is one place where full service works, which is security teams producing security code, authentication, logging, cryptographic code, those sorts of things. those teams get a full service engagement because they're doing absolutely security critical work. And it really requires the maturity of an expert team to do it. For almost everybody else, thinking about how your journey is going to lead to self-service, how close you can get to that results in happier threat modeling processes.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's still certain elements with full that I think still have a little bit of things, especially when you're starting out. I can kind of see where that sits a bit, where maybe some of the folks building their threat models don't quite understand certain security concepts yet, or they're still learning, right? They don't know anything about this, right? They've never touched this before. I don't know what a SQL injection is. I don't know what, whatever that case, that certain risk measure, they may not know those things. So it becomes kind of a partnership in some ways, and it grows from there. And then maybe it moves towards number two. It's more
Yep.
collaborative. And then it moves toward like, I'm comfortable now, I'm just going to do it myself. So, and it depends on whom in your organization, the scope of how you want to build it. But looking through these different delivery mechanisms is going to play a big part, and trying to decide, do I use one, the other, or all three? Do I use one to build to the next and then move to the next?
Yep.
So I think that's how we kind of approach this. But we need a place to start, and that's kind of what this is about today, is how do we look at this as we grow that program? And really, I think when we think about that delivery, we want to build in quality and consistency, not only as the threat modelers ourselves, so that way if I do the model and you do the model, Adam, we both kind of come out with very similar results in terms of our outputs and the quality of the model in itself, because we want that to be able to sustain. Because I see this a lot, and you probably have too, where if I do the risk assessment, you do the risk assessment of something, we get completely different results.
There's nothing that frustrates executives more than ask two experts get three different answers.
Right.
Right. We don't have a program, we have a bunch of people with opinions. Come back to me when you've solved that and we can talk about scaling.
Yeah, no, that is so true. It's confusing, just especially as you're building a program around this too, and anything just in general is when you have that confusion, that just creates more of a reason to like, oh well, I don't understand why we're doing this. I don't know what we're trying to achieve. I don't know why this is not making sense.
Yep.
So defining these things in your scope, your processes, and things like this helps bring you to that level of consistency and quality across your organization. And just remember, this stuff takes time. I'll talk more about that in another session coming, but time is what you need. This is not overnight. I just want everybody to keep in mind the fact that if you start today, you're not going to be there tomorrow. It's going to take you time, and it depends on what challenges you face and things that are going on. So I know a lot of people, been talking about, frameworks and things like that. So I think that's where we want to go next here, is to talk about threat modeling frameworks. Adam, I know your 4 questions are well known all around the world about threat modeling. And so we have these here, and one of the things about frameworks is they provide a foundation, right? How do we start? Where do we begin? And your 4 questions have always been in my mind around how do we approach this? What is a way that we can simply define and ask people questions to bring about building a model that adds value and gives us something to build off of? And so we have these 4 here. What are we building? What can go wrong? What are we going to do about it? And did we do a good job? So I think from this, when we look at the answering of these things, just kind of give us a little bit more about some of these things. I know you and I had spoken before and talked about this and these little bit of the frameworks here. So now let's just dive into that a little more.
Yeah, so actually the first thing I want to mention is a lot of people do this with the 4 questions. No, I'm gonna come to that in a second. The thing that's most important about the framework is it gives us a way to adjust what we're doing to match the thing we're working on. So when we ask, what are we working on? And the answer is a single page web app, making a data flow diagram doesn't work very well. I like to use state machines to express how a single page web app works or a mobile app works. And so one of the mistakes that people make is they say, we're going to use data flow diagrams, we're going to use Stride, we're going to write those things into our policies and we're going to be audited against it, and you're making your life more difficult. If you say we're going to use the 4-question framework, we're going to make sure each team answers those questions, you give people both structure and flexibility. That's what the framework does for you. And the other thing that I want to mention is that the way that the questions are phrased is actually super important. And so a lot of people will write, what are we building? And I think it's important to think about what are we working on, because when we say what are we building, we create this waterfall view of the world. Thank you. And when we say what are we working on, it's what are we working on this sprint? And so to go to a question that Swapnil had asked, if you choose a random framework and realize it didn't work well, that can happen. We'll talk more about specifics, but if you start from the 4 questions and you teach people the 4 questions, it gives them the freedom and the responsibility to figure out how we're going to answer what can go wrong, to figure out how we're going to answer what are we going to do about it. And that's so valuable for driving an effective program.
I use this all the time to explain to people the core of threat modeling, because it's a process of an analysis of how we look at things, understand things, and take action based on what we discover from our analysis of things. And you mentioned before, like, we all threat model. We do this every day, and we walk out on the street, crossing the road in a busy intersection. What are we working on? Well, I'm working on getting to the other side of the street. What can go wrong? Starts downpouring and rain, and I did not bring my umbrella. What am I going to do about it? Well, maybe hide underneath that little bus shelter, until it stops raining. Wait for the crosswalk symbol to go, yes, it's time to walk. And did I do a good job? Am I completely soaked on my way to the interview or not? So you'll find out. But this sets up such a nice way to approach this. And from here, this framework allows us to kind of grow and look at some of the other frameworks that we commonly think about, Stride and some others. So let's go ahead and move to our next slide here, where we dig a little bit more into some of these things. So here we have a list of some common popular frameworks for threat modeling. And so, Adam, can you kind of take us on a walk through these different frameworks and kind of what they've meant over time and years of how these have been leveraged for different program building and how these can help us, or maybe they can also not help us, right? So maybe sometimes it can be a little complex for us to use as well.
Nope, not going to do it. I'm just going to tell people to start with Stride as a way to answer what can go wrong. Okay, I will, but I really want to emphasize the manifesto's point of doing rather than talking about it, and doing rather than getting caught up in a methodological holy war. Sorry, I shouldn't use that phrase anymore, but really, I find that Stride is both teachable, it's general, it has stood the test of time, it's a great starting place. There are lots of other frameworks that people will put forward. I will mention that attack trees don't give you a lot of support in figuring out what goes into the tree. It's very dependent on expertise, but it doesn't provide expertise or a framework for thinking about things
Hmm.
in the way that either stride or kill chains do. And so this goes back to a couple of questions that we've had about choosing a random framework. Yeah, it turns out that they don't always work well, but I think there's two causes for that. One is the training and expertise that people have. The other is choosing a framework that's in widespread use for the sort of thing that you're thinking about. And John, you mentioned not everyone knows what SQL injection is. I learned as I've been delivering training that not everyone understands what repudiation is or um, what spoofing is. And so that led me to write the Star Wars threat book to teach people that, because it does take training and it does take respectful listening to give people a chance to talk about what can go wrong as they're getting started. If we focus too much on we're going to try and compare and we're going to choose the perfect one for us, you're not doing the work, you're not showing the value. Um, and actually, maybe this ties to a question. Let's come back to the ROI questions that are waiting in chat. We'll come back to those.
Hmm.
Um,
The,
but
you know,
yeah, I'm,
go ahead, finish, please.
no, I've said enough on this. Start with
So
Stride, not laundry lists.
yeah, I know. Definitely stride is something there. What I found though is I have the tendency I like to kind of steer away a bit from these formulated frameworks. Now they're good for certain purposes, and what I find though is if I stick to the 4 questions, it makes it a little bit more real to have the conversation rather than trying to explain what does spoofing mean, because then I have to have the conversation go into more of an educational based session to talk about, well, what do you mean by tampering? What do you mean about repudiation? And then if it's an attack tree, well, then now you have to have another skill sets, even with kill chains as well. Oh, what is reconnaissance, enumeration, all these different things that go on requires a specific skill for. Where if I'm asking for questions, it's very easy for us to understand because we do that ourselves, even outside of the context of threat modeling for products, right? We can grasp that very quickly and then begin to think about that. And even without the security expertise, if I look at the function of the product I'm making, oh, well, an administrative user is logging in to the exact same mechanism that the average user is logging in. Well, what's the difference? Well, what other things do I need to ensure? What could go wrong? Well, compromised credentials. Well, what additional layers of security that is going to prevent a crossover? Escalation of privilege is what we may know that as, but most people may not, especially when you're beginning your journey in this. So
Yep.
I like to keep it simple and to not go down that path. I have asked me, like, do we want to use Stride? Do we want to use this? And I said, well, let's not go there yet. Let's focus on doing and not trying to stuff ourselves into a framework at this point in time. We might find later on down the road that we might want to leverage some of that. But I think that's, for when you're building out your program, keep these in mind, but you don't have to lock yourself into something. So,
And I just want to emphasize what you said about the conversation about what spoofing is and getting into teaching instead of delivering core value, right? We've got some questions that we're waiting to answer on return on investment and showing value. And I think that it's so much fun for me as an expert to want to share my knowledge and teach people something, but it can take us away from why are we here? How are we delivering value to the people in the room? It's not by lecturing, it's by finding, oh, this API doesn't have any authentication, we should build an authentication layer into it so that we're not supported, we don't have to come back, cancel a sprint, ship emergency security patches. We don't run into escalations at the end. And these are, by the way, our points about return on investment, is avoiding randomization, avoiding escalation, because we've had a conversation, not a review, but a conversation early on about the security of the system we're building, creates so much value, both from the rework perspective and the perspective of teams collaborating instead of fighting with each other.
Yeah.
Those are some of the points about return on investment. And John,
Yeah.
do you want to pick up the questions that are
Yeah.
there?
Let's just jump to the last slide that
Sorry.
we have, which is some key takeaways from everybody. We got about 8 minutes left, so let me just kind of wrap this part of the presentation. So just remember, from this, we've talked a lot about and determining where you are and where you want to go, right? You need to involve people. You can't do this in a vacuum, right? There's a lot of stakeholders in this. You need to look at, you're planning for maturity to increase. You don't have to be perfect. Your models don't have to be perfect. Things grow, you learn, takes time. Scope what you're planning to do. You don't have to do something huge and big, right? Think about what fits for you and your organization. Look at the scope of what you're planning for your threat modeling efforts, how you're going to deliver your program, and those things. And that's important as we think about, like in number 5, how do you want to deliver this? How are you going to deliver that value? And as we've talked about frameworks, leverage them where you need them. Look at your processes and set yourself some standards by which to operate by. I'm not talking about security standards. I'm talking about your standards on how it will help you deliver, how you will leverage your own processes and involve things like the RACI, these things that helps you build on that program. And that's really kind of the main things that we've talked about here today. So with that, and we have a few minutes left, I think we want to jump into our questions that we have. And so with that, we've got, I think we've talked a lot about this ROI, right? To quantify the value or delivery. I think there are ways, and I do have a session coming up that's towards the end of the series that's going to talk a bit about that, on how do we measure what is a level of success, what is that return on investment. And there are ways to think about that. We look at time, delivery, we look at repeat findings, we look at ways that how we build usage of reference architectures and things of that nature. In our program, there's elements there, like Adam, that you've mentioned already, that builds upon itself that we can then quantifiably measure. But don't forget, when you're measuring things, you have to measure where you are today, so you have something to compare against down the road. And it's not an overnight measure. You have to look at the trend of your data as you move forward. I hope that helps to answer that question. So just let me know if that's okay. So then I'd like to get to our next one. Is how do you present that these threat models to leadership, that it's worth the investment? Is there any concrete calculation that this threat model process has massively reduced the cost of vulnerability damage, which is sometimes is an abstract to see? Yes. A lot of times there's a lot of research around bug fixing in the world of development. I can tell you that security scans will produce X number of security findings, right? Scans, pen tests, so on and so forth. Many times when I've been creating models and analyzing and coming up with things that can go wrong, many times, if they haven't taken any action on those things, which, when you start off, that doesn't always happen. If they're actually accounted for and dealt with, they don't show up in those scans and tests. When I retroactively model something, I have usually found 60 to 80% of those things in the model, just in that analysis. Now, the cost of a bug defect, people can debate this. I'm just going to use the average sum of $10,000 for one. So what happens if I have 10? Well, that's $100,000 worth of rework that I have to go and spend, right? So things of that nature are ways that you can quantify this and actually add some elements there. And then the other measures, like I was saying before, is that time to market. How much time did I have to spend doing rework that delayed me from a release? How much time did I have to wait for a security thing to happen before I could move to my next steps? How many toll gates stop me for a longer period of time? And maybe we can get rid of toll gates so we're constantly, iteratively, always improving as our model stays alive with our product. So that's one thing to that. And Adam, if you have things you want to add to these, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, so I wanted to mention that Arius Risk actually has a great paper or Forrester did a paper
Yeah,
for
Forrester did,
Arius. I forget the exact relationship, but there's a paper, and hopefully that we can get that posted into the Q&A. I wanted to jump to Afonso's question about FDA.
Oh, yeah.
And they ask, what are we working on can take a lot of work. FDA wants a global, a multi-patient harm, an updatability, a security view. But do we get into things like memory protection issues? And I think the way to think about FDA's guidance comes from the title, which is Quality System Considerations. Things like memory protection are going to be handled somewhere else in the quality system, usually. You're going to choose to write in a memory safe language. You're going to use an operating system that gives you memory protection. And my general advice, and this is shocking in the FDA world, but work with me, is to stop early and then to iterate. And the iteration is important. It's easy to go too deep, do a lot of extra work that you don't necessarily need to do, and to go back to that ROI question, people feel their time is being wasted. So stopping, asking, did we do a good job? Do we need to add things to this diagram rather than adding everything you can think of and then saying, oh gosh, we didn't use that, we didn't use that, we didn't use that, gets you to more value quickly than trying to put every last little thing into a model. And one of the things that you will learn if you take training with me is I love the phrase, all models are wrong and some models are useful. The idea is that a model is not the territory, it's not the thing, it's a model. We throw away details, so it has to be wrong. And we have to be okay with that. And so I hope that helps with the FDA question. And I think maybe if we give it, John, do you have any last points? Should we talk about the next episodes?
We can. There's two last questions. I can answer these pretty quickly. So one of them is around, can you share how AI helps with threat modeling, and specifically wanted to understand what process to be followed to scale with repeatable processes. I can tell you, as the AI components, the generative AI stuff that's coming out, that is here already, that is being leveraged in many different capacities, can certainly help and assist with threat modeling. As to repeatable processes with it, I like to think of this generative AI elements for threat modeling as a helper. It's like an assistant sitting with you as you do things. Actually, I did a webinar with another gal, Maria, that we talked about. It was a Gen AI primer and how it could fit in the processes of threat modeling. So I did that with you, Claire. We did that a while back. I think that was sometime earlier in the year, maybe the tail end of last year. So if we're able to pull that link up and find that, then maybe we can share that with folks on the thing. But we did specifically talk about how that can help. So I think that would be good for people to watch. And then, so I think it would be better to go through that rather than trying to explain every single one of those at this point in time. And your other question was around understanding that threat modeling could be implemented at any stage, but securing buy-in from development teams for reviewing existing applications might be seen as additional burden. This is where I think that if you have some threat modeling folks on your team, or you take this in kind of a more of a full service, approach that we looked at, so where we do the heavy lift. And typically I find that people are willing to listen to you when you've kind of built something and have a conversation with them. And I think that, you provide things that they can then add to their next sprint, right? But you have to build a relationship with them in order to make those kinds of things happen.
I know we're running short on time. I just want to say, don't review existing applications. Start with what are we working on, because that's where the change energy is. Eventually, the development teams will say, hey, this was useful. We should go back and look at the old stuff, but get to it by showing them the value, not trying to convince them. They'll find a need to say, hey, we probably have a lot of technical debt with stuff we built before we learned how to do this. And at that point, you're helping them instead of pushing them to do the work.
Yeah, that's a great point that you bring up, is looking at what they're doing now and focusing on what that is, that new feature, those new functions and those elements, and then moving forward. It can be a daunting task to go back and redo everything. I've encountered situations where I've been asked for that, but I prioritize based on criticalities of applications. So,
you know, I worked on Windows. There's a lot of things I would like to add to the Windows threat model that are just hard to change at this point.
Of course.
And you know, this is why it's so valuable to threat model your work early, is because all of the decisions that you wish you had made, many of them are visible if you take a few minutes to ask what can go wrong before you've started writing code. Once the code is written, once the concrete is poured, you're dealing with that for a while. And understanding that will help contribute to the ROI questions that people have been asking.
Yeah.
Speaking of ROI, John, I'm aware that we are a couple of minutes.
Yes, we are.
Should we mention the next events?
Yeah, so the next events, and Claire, if you're able to bring up the slide deck once again and go to the series explanation. You know, I have them in my head, but the order of which is hard for me to remember all the time, especially after this wonderful talk with you, Adam, and everybody here. So setting the scene, and the next event is around building foundations, right? So this talks a little bit more about what are some of those key elements that you need within your program, and things such as processes, training, support. What are the things that are there as part of the program to help drive that in your organization? Other from that is driving adoption. How do we get more people involved? What are the things and triggers where we have more of the organization, you know, wanting to do this? Driving your program is also kind of a continuation of adoption in terms of where do we have things integrate. Many times trying to get somebody to draw a diagram, right? A data flow diagram. I will tell you that almost every architect is already drawing a diagram. It's on a napkin, it's on a whiteboard, it's in Visio, it's in Dry.io, it's in Lucid Charts. It exists somewhere. You already have one. You've already started. So things like that, other integrations with other teams across your organization, from business sides, technical side, so on and so forth. And then, of course, about results. Did we do a good job? Right. So talking about that question of Adam's framework. And then at the end, delivering value, right? How do we show that? What does that look like? You know, and summarizing the series there. So this really, like I said, it builds on each one. So today was setting the scene, you know, and I've had a wonderful pleasure of speaking here with Adam and having this conversation. So thank you. And being able to set this up as we move forward. So each month there will be one of these. As you can see, is a wonderful list of other experts in the field. And it's been an honor to have you, Adam, here with the first one as we set this all up with everyone. And you never know, Adam, maybe you want to pop in again. So we'll see. But in any case, yeah, so thank you, everyone, for joining. I hope you've enjoyed this. I know I certainly have had a good time with this. Adam, over to you. Any other last thoughts or?
Hey, Edward. But just wanted to say thank you to all of you for participating, for all the great questions. And I'm sure this is going to be an awesome series. And so look forward to seeing you all next month.
Mm-hmm.
See you there. Thank you all so much. Thank you, John and Adam, for a great session.
Yeah. Thank
Bye.
you. All right. Bye-bye now.